It's great to be back with the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations and meet all of you. Thank you for taking the time to come over to the U.S. and spend about a week here, I think, engaging in this foreign policy colloquium. As Jan said, September 11th weighs heavily on a lot of our minds still. 12 years ago when that attack occurred, I was, like you, in graduate school. I was in graduate school studying law at the University of California in Los Angeles, UCLA. Having spent several years in the Army before that, it was an interesting opportunity to be in law school studying principles of U.S. law while dealing with a broader national security change that was around us. I then practiced law for a few years while staying in the Army, went to Iraq and fought in Iraq for a year in 2005 and 2006. And then as I came home, became more politically active and became part of the Obama presidential campaign in 2007 and 2008, and then eventually served as part of the administration in 2009, where I managed detainee policy for the Defense Department for a year. And in that job, dealt with this tension in a very direct way as we managed the facility at Guantanamo Bay and managed detainee issues in Iraq and Afghanistan and also elsewhere around the world. Since then, I've left government service and have moved back to the practice of law and back to working in a think tank environment where I'm able to think more broadly about the tension between liberty and security and also some of the broader themes in American society right now. And there's a lot in the news. If you've been reading the U.S. press for the last week, you've seen stories about Guantanamo Bay in the news again, with the president renewing his pledge to close the facility. You've seen stories about drones, or what we call remotely piloted aircraft, but most people call them drones, and their use in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Somalia, Yemen, and other countries. You've seen stories about the Justice Department of the U.S. government putting journalists under surveillance for walking around the same State Department building that you guys walked around, I think, this morning. You've seen stories about the Internal Revenue Service of the U.S. government, the people who collect taxes, putting more surveillance on conservative groups than on liberal groups. And you've seen probably other stories that highlight these tensions in American society. It is something of a perennial tension for us. And it's a tension that's gotten a lot harder to manage for a variety of reasons. It's a more complex world. There are, in the U.S.'s view, more adversaries and more competitors out there than just the Soviet Union or just Germany or just other countries going back many decades. It's a world where technology enables bad things to happen much more quickly and with much more consequence. A small device can kill a lot of people very fast. A small flash drive can steal a lot of secrets very quickly. And a small leak in your internet or your connectivity to the internet can cause massive damage to national security, as the U.S. government has seen with the WikiLeaks theft of diplomatic cables and other pieces of information. In this age, I think the U.S. government also feels that time has been compressed, that 60 years ago we could wait days or weeks to make a decision because the time it took a threat to move from Europe to our shores or from Asia to our shores was very long. Today, the threat can come from Yemen to the United States in less than 24 hours to blow up a bomb, and can come via cyber or other vectors instantly. And so that also animates a great deal more aggressiveness on the part of the U.S. government. Pushing back on this, though, is always this American ideal that we are free in our own country, we should be free from surveillance, and we should be free in a lot of respects from the government's aggressive law enforcement in this area. And that's particularly true in a few different contexts. The Associated Press scandal that you're seeing unfolding this week and last week is very interesting because for the U.S. government, it's one thing to put a private citizen under surveillance, particularly if that private citizen is assumed to have taken stolen property or classified information from the U.S. government. It's another thing to put the press under surveillance, because then you're not just dealing with their privacy interest, but you're also infringing their First Amendment right to be a free press. And so this has created a great deal of difficulty for the Justice Department and for the Obama administration in reconciling. Similarly, with the IRS scandal, you're seeing not just the tension involved with privacy, but the whole idea of political expression coming up as well, and whether the government should be involved in telling certain political groups it should censor or not. And that is also something that the U.S. government has frankly not had to wrestle with for many years. And this is going to be a very hard thing for the administration to figure out and probably to fix in the next few weeks or months. It's probably the case that they've lost a lot of trust, and that the U.S. government's going to have to take weeks, months, and years to rebuild that trust with these organizations and the public at large. Drones is a different situation entirely, and there I think what you see is a government that's trying very hard to fight a war against al-Qaeda, and not just al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and Pakistan, but also in Somalia and Yemen and elsewhere around the world, and do so in a way that is very precise and almost surgical in its precision, but also in a way that's humane by not creating a lot of collateral damage. I think the risk is that even though these drones kill fewer civilians, and even though they are objectively, as military people think of these things, more humane than, say, an artillery barrage, more humane than a massive invasion, they arouse a certain visceral reaction from people, because there's something about them that seems what we would call Orwellian, sort of futuristic and dangerous in the same way, and in some ways immoral, because we are fighting war without putting our own citizens or soldiers at risk. And I think that this is going to be a tension the U.S. is going to have to deal with in the next few years, is how does it reconcile this military power with the need to be seen as legitimate in the use of that power. This is going to be a problem. This is going to be hard not just for us, but also for other great powers and rising powers like China and like India and like Brazil and countries in Europe that have power but need to act legitimately in the world in order to make that power be effective. And I think that, drones are in many ways only an interim technology. Drones are not that much more of a leap forward than the cruise missile or the intercontinental ballistic missile. They are just a little bit further of a technology, but you're about to see truly cutting-edge technology hit the streets in the next 5 to 10 years that will marry fully autonomous drones, that is, drones that don't have to have a pilot playing like a video game, and technologies like 3D printing, which will allow countries to mass produce armies of autonomous drones and do so with no relationship between the size of the country or the natural resources of the country or any other constraints that have typically constrained warfare for the last several hundred years. And so it's possible to imagine a very small, wealthy, technologically advanced country, say for illustrative purposes, one of the Gulf Coast countries in the Middle East, building an army of millions that fast and using that to oppose the exercise of power by Iran, by the United States, by China, and by others. And this could really change the fundamental power dynamics of the world. The one thing that seems to be constraining this right now is law, and a sense of the international community, in a sense that countries don't want to open that Pandora's box. There's probably a moment right now when the U.S., in conjunction with other great powers like the other members of the Security Council, could build an international legal regime to structure this in the same way that was done for nuclear weapons in the 1940s and 1950s. And if that happens, we'll probably see this channeled in a more constructive way. We'll see it regulated. We'll see it managed in a way that's conducive to international order. but it's anyone's guess as to whether or not that's going to happen. So, drones today are a problem. Drones tomorrow could be a much bigger problem, and one that doesn't just affect the people in places like Somalia, but would also affect all of us. The other big thing that I think is fundamentally changing the balance of liberty and security in the U.S. is data. And the way that what we call in the U.S. big data is transforming law enforcement and transforming the very idea of privacy. So in the U.S., we have this idea of privacy that you should be secure in your own home. You should be secure from any sort of government surveillance or government searches or government seizures. And then if the police or the Justice Department want to come and search your house or seize your property, they have to get a warrant from a court. There are very big exceptions in that, though. One of them is where you consent to the search. So you voluntarily say, walk through an airport. If you do that, you consent to the government searching you. If you provide the government with your information voluntarily, you have consented to that search of that information or the seizure of that information. And in this day and age, simply by having, an iPhone, I provide so much of my data voluntarily to Verizon or AT&T or Google or many other companies that I really don't have any information that's private unless I write it down on a piece of paper and I keep it inside my house. Anything I share with my commercial vendors, with my bank, with my phone company, or with others is now publicly available. And if the government wants it, it can purchase it, and it can aggregate all of that data into very large systems that are capable of consuming and analyzing very large amounts of data and doing predictive analysis on that data. There are good sides to this. If you're looking for the Boston bomber and you want to find them very fast, then you can use big data to do that through facial recognition software and through analysis of phone records and analysis of global positioning system data. But if you are a private person and if you want to conceal your activities, or let's say you're doing something that's maybe a little embarrassing, it's not criminal, but it's embarrassing. Maybe you're having an affair. Maybe you're doing something that you don't want other people to know about because you're ashamed of it. You haven't told your parents about it. You haven't told your spouse about it. The government can find that out too. And it can find it out not by going in and seizing it the old-fashioned way, but simply by looking in the sea of big data at what you already share publicly and pulling that in and analyzing it. And this is going to fundamentally change the way that the U.S. thinks about privacy in years to come. It already has, and it's going to get more and more so that way. If you were to look out across the United States and look for places where you still have an expectation of privacy, the only place you really have an expectation of privacy now in the United States is in your home. And only if you are not connected to the internet, you are not connected to phone lines, and you are not engaging in any sort of commerce. That is effectively the only private place in America today, because every time you travel on a public road or in a public place or use public commerce or use public telephone lines, you are acting in a public sphere where the government has, under fairly well-settled law, the right to look at what you're doing. And this is a big change. This is something that didn't exist 30 years ago or even 10 years ago. It will probably get to the point where in 20 years from now we'll miss it. We'll know that something is gone. We'll look back and sort of wonder when it happened. We'll think nostalgically about the day when the government actually had to get a warrant to listen to a telephone conversation instead of just monitoring everything that went across the internet. But the change is happening now. And I suspect it's not going to just happen here. It's going to happen around the world. Even in Europe, European law enforcement is taking a much more aggressive stance towards privacy because of the terrorism threat they face, because of other threats they face, and conventional notions of privacy are being redefined there. Technology also works the other way, though. And I was at a conference last week with a number of Chinese hacktivists, sort of a combination of the word hacker and activist. And they were talking about the ways that they use technology to get around all these government surveillance systems, that they've created email systems that are capable of vanishing the moment someone reads the email. They've created very sophisticated systems of routing messages and content that evade firewalls. And they're doing it largely in places like China, Iran, and elsewhere to allow information to move more freely. And I think that there is going to be a contest. There already is a contest, but it's going to get even more escalated over the coming years that really brings those things in conflict. And that may be the big tension that you all see in China in years to come is between freedom of information and control of information. That's probably enough for me to stop and answer questions, because in the last couple of times, the questions have always been the better discussion anyway. So I would love to hear what you all think, and I'd love to hear your questions and talk with you about these subjects. And
I'm Eugene. I study in Public Service Administration in Bush School, Texas A&M University. Mr. Carter, my question is just directly related to today's topic about the liberty and security. We know that after the 9/11, the U.S. put the counterterrorism to a priority place. So also there is an act called the Patriot Act. But some people, they argue that the Patriot Act, they increase the level of surveillance, has conflict with or violates the Constitution of the U.S. So how do you see this argument?
The U.S. Congress passed a very large statute called the Usa Patriot Act. It was about 1,000 pages long. It had a ton of provisions in it, some relating to surveillance, some relating to immigration, some relating to banking, some relating to product liability. The surveillance provisions have mostly focused on a kind of surveillance the U.S. government does for intelligence purposes. And there the effect has been to enable more U.S. government surveillance of foreign intelligence targets. So if we think there's a spy, let's say it's an Iranian spy who's seeking to kill the Saudi ambassador. True story, this person was sentenced yesterday for doing this. This law enables the U.S. government to more easily surveil that person and catch them while they're doing that. By and large, there has not been a huge outcry about that power. There has been some outcry about pieces of it. Some people are concerned about the extent to which the Justice Department would look at library records or other public records that people have. There's also been a great deal of concern about the way the Justice Department would use what are called national security letters that are kind of like search warrants, but there's no court involved. This is where the FBI just sends a letter to, let's say, Verizon and asks for phone records. And there have been some efforts by Congress to restrict those things. But what happened more recently is that Congress has extended those provisions and reauthorized them because of the recognition that even though there's a cost there, Congress believes that they're doing some good and they are helping the U.S. government to catch people like that Iranian operative that they couldn't otherwise have caught. So I think in terms of the balance between liberty and security, for now, the U.S. feels comfortable with keeping those provisions in law.
My name is Ying. I'm from the University of Texas at Dallas. My major is political science, public policy and political economy. My question is, 2 weeks ago, the American aircraft carrier just finished the coordinated joint exercise with Korea and Japan in China's East Sea. And this week, and we found the carrier showed in the China's South Sea. So does it show the American wants to enhance the naval cooperation with the southeastern countries or more Asian countries? That's my question. Thank you.
Those maneuvers were part of securing the global commons. This is something the U.S. government takes very seriously, and I know you have other people that are more expert in this area of foreign policy, but the U.S. believes and has believed for 200 years that international waters should be free for all countries to navigate and for commerce to move freely. And so, beyond certain limits, beyond the 12-mile limit, beyond certain other places that are considered to be international waters, the U.S. believes that all nations should be able to navigate those waters.
I may miss your point, but please help me make it clear. Are all of our emails and instant messaging and short messages under the monitoring of the U.S. government and the intelligence agency, so that someday we may get caught by the government or agency if we are joking about something?
And you should be aware that if the U.S. government isn't doing it, then Facebook and Google are. The companies that you use for instant messaging or communication are actively looking at the content of what you're sending and doing their own analysis on it. So that when you see ads pop up on the side of the Facebook page, they're not doing that by accident. They're doing that because of what you're talking about. And these companies are absolutely doing that. And there's only a little step there for the U.S. government to get that information too. It's still a little step. It's still a protection that the U.S. government doesn't typically, the U.S. government doesn't always do that. It can. It usually only does that when it has a search warrant or has some sort of an active reason to do so. And in that sense, it is different from other governments that automatically look at all things. I think
perhaps that you are all very familiar with.
Comes to mind. But the data is there, and it's being analyzed. And I think that if you are very concerned about that in the U.S., you have to now aggressively protect your privacy and not take it for granted. Whereas 30 or 40 years ago, when the only communication was by handwritten or paper letter and by analog telephone signal, it was much easier to protect your privacy. So that's a big change for us.
In all languages, including Mandarin, German, English, Japanese.
I mean,
Yes.
Perhaps. I don't know.
But I think the point is what he's saying at this point. Yes, we have people who speak and read Japanese and Korean and Farsi and any other language at our national security agency.
You should also think that all communication can be reduced to binary digital language. And all communication, regardless of its language, can be understood in that context as math. And in that sense, can be analyzed by any government or private actor with the computing power that's necessary, whether it's Google or the U.S. government or the Chinese government or another. So your security is in your hands.
Good morning. My name is Eric Zhang Shuo. My major is civil engineering in Florida International University. My question is because, the privacy is a really important issue of all the people. It's kind of one key point of what American believe for freedom and liability. And now it's a critical issue because the government can fetch that information from everybody very easily. But meanwhile, there are critics about Cuba and North Korea about the government monitoring and tracking people. So what do you think the difference between these two systems, and what do you think the red line that the government should not cross for this issue? Thank you.
It's too easy to simply say these things are similar. In fact, I think Cuba and North Korea are way over here, and the U.S. is pretty far from that. I think that the line that divides them, or the gap that divides them, is this idea that there should be some individualized suspicion before the U.S. government reads your mail or before the U.S. government listens to your conversation. That's something that still exists. The U.S. government will look at a lot of data just to understand patterns, but they won't look at a particular person until there is suspicion about that person. And the presumption still in the U.S. system is that you're innocent until you're proven guilty. And no one is deprived of their liberty without a trial with all the protections under the U.S. Constitution and then a guilty verdict from a jury of 12 of their peers. That does not exist in Cuba. It does not exist in North Korea. It does not exist in Iran. It doesn't exist in other countries as well. And I think that still makes this country special. Where you see erosion is on the idea of what should be private and what should be public, and how quickly the government can get access to things if it wants to. But that's also being driven by the sense that the government needs that. And if someone shows up and starts sending more letters containing rice into Congress, or blowing up additional sporting events in other cities, then I think that will highlight why this need exists, that the U.S. feels it's still under threat, and it still feels the need to have this capability to get that information.
I'm Lynn. I'm the first-year law school student at University of Tennessee. Because you used to be a lawyer for government contracts, so what's the most common issues between the governments to settle down their deals or treaties?
This is an interesting point. The U.S. government over the last 20 years has increasingly relied on contractors to do a lot of its work. About 20 years ago, under the Clinton administration, the U.S. government decided to transfer hundreds of thousands of jobs from the government service to the private sector. And so large parts of the Defense Department, the Treasury Department, the State Department, and every other government department are now run out of the private sector by companies like IBM, Lockheed, SAIC, and others. And the big issue that gets fought about between the government and the private companies is the same issue that gets fought about between all customers and contractors, and that's price. There's a debate in almost every contract about whether the government is getting what it asked for and whether it's paying too much or too little. And sometimes these disputes are managed very smoothly, and sometimes they have to go to court and fight over them in the courts. And there, the disputes can last for years, and the amount of legal fees generated can cost millions, and the government can be disagreeing about amounts in the billions of dollars. These are very big contracts. That's, it's an interesting area of the law. It's also a change in the way that our government does business that's probably here with us to stay. There is, and this is something you all have probably gotten from other speakers, something of a change in the U.S. government's fiscal environment over the last few years, that we are now entering what many call the age of austerity, with sequestration and declining budgets, and in particular declining budgets for the wars. The government has been forced to make cuts in a lot of programs, and one of the things that it's trying to do is figure out the most efficient way to do business. So, how can it most efficiently deliver the mail, or how can it most efficiently deliver Social Security benefits or other things, and whether it costs more or less to use private contractors to do that or to use government employees to do that. And there's a big debate right now in the U.S. About what's the best answer there. And when the U.S. decides that, there's going to be a lot of litigation over that decision, as either side, whether it's the government contractors or the labor unions, fight the decision.
Isn't there also an issue of morality in some of these, not necessarily the mailman delivering the mail, but when you're hiring what some people would call mercenaries to carry out duties that U.S. government, that you did as a soldier? Can you talk a little bit about that
Yeah,
issue?
so there's an interesting tension in the war context when the U.S. hires contractors to serve in a place like Iraq or Afghanistan. And the one that comes to mind is the company Blackwater, which had at one time about 2,500 or 3,000 armed security contractors guarding convoys and conducting missions in Iraq and Afghanistan. In one sense, it's very different from asking soldiers to go serve. In another, it's not that different. We have an all-volunteer military, and we pay the military very well to do things on our behalf. It's a military that is self-selecting. The main difference between the contractor personnel and the military personnel is often simply who they work for. Mm-hmm. They have very similar qualifications. They have very similar backgrounds. They do very similar things. And so in some ways, these two things are fungible. And I don't see as much of a moral issue there as more of a structural one. And that's a question of, can you hold contractors as accountable for what they do as you can hold military personnel? Because there's a more robust system of justice in place for military personnel and for government personnel than there is for contractor people.
And my question is kind of related to the private sector. And as we know, Facebook, Google, those technology companies has been built a platform for people to not only get information, but also calling out each other to the public gathering. And there is an opinion urge those companies to have their own foreign policy regarding national security issues. I'm just wondering what's your take on that?
This has been an issue for a while, that large companies do have their own foreign policy. You see it with oil companies. You see it with telecommunications companies. You see it with very large investment funds and investors like George Soros, who, through the size of his investments, can manipulate currencies. And I think that in this new world we live in, governments are not the only actors. I think you're absolutely right. Large companies like Google and IBM and Coca-Cola and other nations' companies too. British Petroleum comes to mind. These companies have foreign policy too, and they engage with governments not just as subservient actors, but as peers. And that's the new world we live in. And I think that in many ways, this is slightly different from what you asked. The U.S. is going to increasingly act through private companies in the future. The U.S. government has less of a tolerance to do things directly than it had 10 years ago before the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. There's a great deal of fatigue among the American people for interventions in places like Syria or Libya or Somalia or elsewhere. But we might rely on large U.S. companies to act in those places instead. And so it's possible to imagine ExxonMobil or Coca-Cola or some other large companies doing work in these places and being our proxies in much the same way that other countries' industry are acting as their proxies in places like sub-Saharan Africa or Latin America or elsewhere. And I think that will be one of the foreign policy competitions of the next 50 years.
From Johns Hopkins side, my question is about morality in war and the moral code you have in battle zone. So since the operator of the drones have been found to under a very severe psychological and morality pressure, people criticize them. They just play video games to shoot in Turkey. But now it just say that the next generation of the drone is like totally artificial intelligence, war machine. So how do you apply the morality, the basically human behavior code in war? I mean, if you're using this kind of machine?
I think you first have to start from the premise that war can be made moral in the first place. There are many people who believe that there is no morality in war at all, and that killing is always wrong. The Western school of thought has always believed that, or at least for the last several hundred years has believed, that war can be moral if it's just. And to be a just war, it has to be necessary. It has to be fought as a matter of last resort. And it has to be fought with means that are humane. And when we think about the means that are humane, we think about really three things. We think about necessity, that we only kill when it's necessary. We think about distinguishing between civilians and combatants. And we think about proportionality. That is, that you should not destroy a city to take out one group of people, that you should use only the force that's proportional to the objective. In many ways, under the Western school of thought, drones meet all of these criteria. If you assume that the war is moral and just, and if you assume that it's necessary, then a drone is no different from a plane or a cruise missile or an artillery barrage at accomplishing its objective. And in many ways, the drone can do that job more effectively and more precisely, and therefore, according to Western theory, be more humane and more moral. I think the challenge comes in when you deal with autonomous or artificially intelligent drones, because the actual act of killing is done by a machine. So if something is done wrong, who do you hold accountable? Do you hold accountable the person who programmed it, the person who built it, the person who launched it, or someone else? We don't know. You also have, I think, a criticism that has come up, which is that it is immoral to wage war without putting yourself at some risk. That there's almost a notion of chivalry that goes back to the medieval Europe, where warfare should be fair, and you should have some risk when you choose to do that. And of course, fully autonomous, artificially intelligent drones entail no risk at all. And many people say that if you do that, if the U.S. government were to deploy those systems, then it would effectively be rejecting all of the norms of warfare. And it would then be okay for its enemies to attack civilians in the U.S. or do whatever they could in response. So these are the big questions that I think you have to wrestle with as you consider these technologies. And they are similar to the way that people had to rethink the way they felt about warfare in the 1940s when nuclear weapons were developed. I think it's that big of a strategic moment that we're about to encounter.
I'm a first-year MPP student at this University of Southern California. My name is Lisa Wang. And I have a question, as we all know, freedom of speech is a right that is prescribed by the Constitution, U.S. Constitution. And sometimes it is the freedom of speech that is in conflict with the national security. There used to be some cases about the reporters, they use their resources to get information and publish this information to the public, and regarding maybe have the possibility to affect the national security. So how do you see that, and how do you see the government should balance the freedom of speech and the national security?
Every time the U.S. government has tried to censor a newspaper and tell it that it can't publish something or prosecute a newspaper for doing something, it's lost. The U.S. Supreme Court has pretty consistently held that there is an absolute right to publish information regardless of whether it's classified. And the big case on point comes to us from the 1970s when the New York Times and the Washington Post got a copy of the Pentagon Papers, which was the Pentagon's internal history of the Vietnam War and all the decisions they made. And it was very embarrassing. And it showed that the U.S. government knew it was making a mistake as it was doing it. And the Supreme Court said, we understand this is classified. We hear the government saying that it will do damage, but under our system, it still can be published. And as it turned out, in the long run, it didn't do that much damage at all. So
the president lost his job over it. But
and a few other things.
And, yes.
And that's still the case. So when all the WikiLeaks information came out, the New York Times and the Washington Post and a few other newspapers had been approached by WikiLeaks before they published that stuff on the internet. And they'd been offered all this material, which was classified and considered to be government property. And the newspapers took it, and then they went to the U.S. government and asked for comment. The U.S. government asked them to wait to publish, and they asked them to scrub out some of the names of Iraqis and Afghans and others that were in that information. But in the end of the day, the New York Times published that, as did a number of other media publications. And I think that that will continue to be true, that the U.S. will continue to allow those types of secrets to be published by the press when the press gets them. What you maybe don't see is there's an enormous amount of cooperation that happens outside of public view between the press and the government. That every time the press learns of a secret that it thinks might be sensitive, they will call the government and tell them what they have and give them an opportunity to make an argument as to why that shouldn't be released. And in a lot of cases, the journalists will withhold things that are too sensitive or that might put people in jeopardy because they don't want to get someone killed. And they take that responsibility pretty seriously too. And that, I think, will also continue.
My concern is about the relationship between personal security and national security. And in early March, one Chinese national scientist working for NASA were arrested by FBI, just suspending him selling the information to Chinese military. So I just wonder, but it's turned out he was innocent in the end. So I just wonder, is a Chinese scientist are easily targeted by the FBI or vulnerable to their national security concern in United States?
The U.S. government restricts its most sensitive work to people who have security clearances from the U.S. government. To get a security clearance, you have to be a U.S. citizen. But we are a nation of immigrants, and so we all come from someplace else originally. And oftentimes, U.S. citizens who come from countries that have an adversarial relationship with the U.S., Iran, and not just national security, but also that engage in a lot of corporate espionage. So Iran, Israel, Korea, Taiwan, China, and a number of other countries go through additional scrutiny before they can get a clearance, and then face additional scrutiny after they start work as well. Or if they travel back home very frequently, that will be a cause for scrutiny. That is the way that the U.S. conducts security for these things. The U.S. is also very worried about industrial espionage originating out of those countries. And so there is some reason for concern, in my opinion, based on what I've read in recent reports, that there is a great deal of secret stealing occurring by Chinese companies and by other companies. There was a recent study by a firm called Mandiant about industrial espionage efforts originating in the People's Republic of China that has caused an enormous amount of concern in the U.S. and has done enormous damage to the reputation of Chinese industry and the Chinese government among firms that simply don't trust anyone from China anymore because of that. And any ties get scrutinized now because of that type of activity. So that is the nature of the world we now live in, where there is a very high level of suspicion right now about countries that engage in high levels of industrial espionage. It's not just China, it's also the other ones I mentioned. But certainly the majority of that attention does fall on China right now.
My question is regarding the, in the past several years, we also have seen the urge from the public to seek more information from the government, not just in China, but also in America. Some information, one evidence is that when countries try to prosecute like the founder of WikiLeaks, we actually get a lot of support from the people. And another evidence in China is like, it's apparent that it's very difficult to people to understand, to know how much wealth each government has in China. So people, grassroots people in China use proxy, the number of watches, the brands of the watches to judge, to guess how much illegal wealth they have accumulated in their positions. So, that comes to a question about more information that people would like to see regarding the government. Just imagine that if we use big data technology to mine the information that's publicly available on government websites, then and there's a conflict between the need from the people and the security of the government. And how do you see that will evolve in the future?
At a basic level, I agree with you. The people have a right to know how big their government is and how much money it is spending. And it has that right because the money in our system belongs to the people. So the U.S. government spends the taxes that it collects from everyone. And because of that, the people have a right to know what they're spending money on, how many people they're employing, what they're doing with that money, and so forth. It can be hard to get that information. And so journalists oftentimes use big data to get that by, for example, looking at all the job postings that government puts out on the internet and then using that data to piece together the size of the government based on some analysis of if it has this many job postings, then the agency is this big and this is how it's structured and so forth. I think you can also do that with things like vehicle counts. I think you can do it by looking at real estate footprint and other types of data that's publicly available. And that can be done for other countries too. So if you wanted to know the size of the Chinese government, you would probably start by counting the people that go in and out of government buildings. And you would probably also do things like looking at watches, looking at suits, looking at cars. These were things that were done very successfully to look at the Soviet Union and the structure of its internal government and the wealth that it transferred to a lot of its government officials. I think that they work very well across government lines. It will become harder and harder for government to keep those kinds of secrets. In this day and age, you can keep a secret if it's in someone's head and only one person's head. You can keep a secret if it's a discussion in a closed facility that's locked off from the world. But the minute you do something in the real world, it's not a secret. And so, when we had the raid that killed Osama bin Laden, the minute they landed in Pakistan, there was no secret at all. People were tweeting about that. And the minute the U.S. government does something anywhere else in the world, the same is true. And I suspect the same is true of any other government, that the minute it does something in the real world, the physical world that's discernible by observation or by other sorts of data tools, then you can learn about it too.
Pian Shi from Yale University. I'm a PhD student in sociology. So my question is, as we have heard some speakers talk about, with the economic crisis and the economic downturn of the U.S. government and the fiscal crisis, so I'm wondering what's the policy in terms of national defense and how would that influence American foreign policy in terms of security and the relationship in terms of the big power of U.S. in the world? Thank you.
The U.S. government is going to spend less on defense than it has over the last 12 years. I think that is clear. It will also not fight the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and so we'll be able to save a lot of money too. I think the hard challenge is how it will change the type of investment it spends on defense to be more efficient and to get more bang for its buck, so to speak. There's a great deal of thought going into how to do that in the future. I think we're also going to work more with allies and more with private industry to project U.S. power abroad. And I also think that while the U.S. government will spend less on defense, the U.S. government is not in decline, nor is the economy in decline. The stock market is still strong. The fundamentals of the economy are still strong. There are still, particularly in the energy market, changes afoot now, which will change the U.S. from a net importer to an exporter of energy in the coming decades, and a few other things that will really change the economic calculus for the U.S. going forward, that will provide a firm foundation of national power in the coming decades. But right now we spend too much on defense, and we waste a lot of money on defense too. If you were to drive from here out to the Dulles Airport, you would see along the highway a series of very, very nice glass and steel buildings populated by defense contractors building all kinds of products that may or may not do anything for our national defense. There's a lot of waste. There are a lot of nice buildings that do nothing for our national defense. That will stop. And that will stop pretty abruptly in the next year or two when the war goes away. But you're still going to have a pretty solid foundation beneath that of a military, a State Department, an intelligence community, and others that are very capable. And the U.S. still spends, even after the cuts projected, more than the rest of the world combined on national security. So that's still, I think, a pretty solid investment and one that will continue to generate a great deal of American power abroad.
And my question is regarding Guantanamo Bay. I noticed you wrote a brief about this before, and my question is: so Guantanamo Bay is a huge prison that detains whoever is considered as a terrorist. So President Obama recently renewed his promise to close the Guantanamo Bay. I'm just wondering, because he has made this promise a number of times, do you see this coming true this time, and why?
Note a couple of things. One, Guantanamo currently holds 166 detainees. The U.S. Justice Department and our civilian system of justice currently holds more than twice that number of international terrorists in federal prison who have been convicted in civilian court and who are now serving life sentences. So we actually hold more international terrorists in civilian prisons than we now hold at Guantanamo. And that number is gradually getting, that ratio is getting more pronounced. Second, I would say that a lot has changed in the last 4 years, that Iraq has ended as a war. Afghanistan is very different now than it was 4 years ago. There are many fewer troops there, and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and Pakistan is not the threat it used to be. That helps us in terms of releasing detainees or transferring detainees back to those countries. That's much easier to do now that those wars are in a very different place. Yemen is also in a more stable place, which is why the president is going to authorize the transfer of detainees back to Yemen. That cuts in half the number of detainees just with those changes alone. And I think that the remainder of other changes that are being put in place do make it more likely that we're going to have a much smaller population in Guantanamo. And if there are 40 or 60 detainees there instead of 160, it's much easier to think about bringing those to the U.S. or bringing those to another location and managing that population than it is today. So I'm very optimistic that by the end of the president's second term, we will close that facility.
As I know, like Chinese is one of the critical languages. Just like Chinese language flagship program at ASU, this program is fully funded by U.S. government. So my question is, what role do you think foreign languages play in national security of the United States? And will you invest more in the future in foreign language education? Thank you.
In every war we've fought, we have not spoken the language of the place where we fought. So that's been true of Germany and Italy. It's been true of Japan. It's been true of Korea, Vietnam, Iraq. And it has handicapped us in war. It's also handicapped us in diplomacy because we have too few people who speak the language of our biggest trading partners, whether it's China or Japan, or whether it's France, or whether it's Germany or Canada, which speaks mostly English but also speaks French in one part. And so this is a strategic disadvantage for the U.S. It's something the U.S. government would like to invest more in, but I think going forward, as long as Chinese students are learning English, we will probably instead spend more money on science, technology, and math education than on language education, because English has become enough of a global language for business that we feel we can assume risk there, and we would rather invest in more science and math education instead. Ideally, you would do both, but if the U.S. can only afford one, it's going to do it, I think, it's going to invest more in the science and math education.
I have a question. When the Boston bombing is coming, and I saw a news that there is a different process of reviewing the student visa of foreign student. And so I'm thinking, since there is a good chance that a lot of tourists are foreigners and new immigrants, so do you think there is effect on the immigration policy?
Yeah, their immigration policy has always reflected a blend of different things in the U.S. It's reflected economic concerns, not wanting to have too many people come in to take U.S. jobs or getting the right mixture of foreign immigrants. It's reflected cultural concerns, and in many years past, racial concerns as well. But there's always been this idea of national security in the immigration process, and the idea that as part of applying for a visa or applying for citizenship, the U.S. government gets to pick who it lets in. And this is consistent with international law, that countries get to allow the people into their country that they want and that they believe are going to be safe. And so as the U.S. sees a threat from any place in the world, it's going to apply more scrutiny to people coming from that place. So if there's a threat from Chechnya, then anyone who comes to the U.S. with a Chechnya citizenship, seeking a visa, is going to get more scrutiny. If there's a threat from Iran, the same thing is going to happen. If there's a threat from China, the same thing is going to happen. And I think that is something that the U.S. has always been doing and has always been fairly transparent about as well, and will probably continue to do going forward.
So I'm Juan Zhen from the University of California, Santa Barbara. I'm actually studying in the electrical and computer engineering. So I'm from a little bit different perspective than other people. I feel like why do people feel more threat than chance for the technology? Because the technology is neutral. So if you use it properly to empower the personal, each person, that will protect your privacy as a security. So my question then is that is there any discussion or idea starting to rise that think about how to empower the individual instead of thinking about how to protect or against those kind of privacy threats from technology. So
the ability to investigate people where it believes there may have been a crime or there may be a threat. So if people had email that couldn't be read or phone calls that couldn't be tapped, then in those cases where you have a murderer or you have a bank robber or you have some other crime, then the U.S. government would be powerless. And so, this is one of those cases where they have to balance respect for privacy with the need, the public need, the collective need to be able to police up issues where they occur. And the way that the U.S. government does that is by only allowing that type of surveillance when there's that individualized suspicion, but not giving that person the ability to evade surveillance completely. So that's the way we do it here.